Our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, also Alan Dershowitz, Harvard Law professor, emeritus, and author of The Case Against the Democratic House Impeaching Trump. Dan, your reaction. What are we seeing here?
Well, look, there are a number of issues here. First of all, you hear Mr. Abrams talking about the fact that the story was already out there. That's not the question. We know that the story was already out there. The pictures weren't out there. So the question is, was this a clear threat to say, unless you say what we want you to say, we're going to publish these photos that you don't want out there? So saying that the story's out there doesn't really change the discussion. And then he says, well, we just wanted the truth. Well, the way you get the truth is, you can go back and forth. You can say, look, we think that what you're saying is untrue and libelous and we'll sue you, et cetera. But it gets close. It gets close to this edge. Look, my position is this is kind of extortion-y. It's kind of blackmail-y. But it may not necessarily be the legal definition of extortion or blackmail.
Alan, is there a First Amendment defense here?
There is. The First Amendment needs breathing room. This is a fight between two media moguls. There was a negotiation. It was a tough negotiation. I'm certainly not here to defend the journalistic ethics of the National Enquirer, but the First Amendment doesn't distinguish between the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC News, and the National Enquirer. The First Amendment needs breathing room. You remember Adlai Stevenson once famously said to one of his opponents, if you promise to stop telling lies about me, I will promise to stop telling the truth about you. You need breathing room here. And I agree with Dan that you need to draw a line between what is extortion-ish and what is extortion consistent with the First Amendment.
Okay, you guys you guys are both the lawyers, so I'm hesitant to practice one on television, but I did look at the code. And Dan, let me start this with you. I mean, the Code Against Extortion says basically you can't threaten something in return for something of value. Right. Renouncing the legal claims, giving a public statement in support, saying it wasn't politically motivated, isn't that a thing of value? Yeah,
look, it could be. And they, you could argue that it was a threat. But it's not that clear, right? It's right on that line where prosecutors are going to evaluate, was this actually a threat? And was this a thing of value? But I'll say in response to what Alan is talking about the First Amendment, look, extortion is always about words. And, typically when someone extorts someone else, they're using words. You don't say, well, nothing that I say can be deemed to be a crime. There are crimes based on words, and that's what extortion is.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that we're dealing with media here. And remember, too, that the alleged extortion occurred in a letter from a lawyer. I've been practicing law for over 50 years. I've never seen an extortion come in the form of a letter from the lawyer.
But even if that's actually not. I think if there was going to be extortion here, it would actually be the letter from the chief content officer
you don't get
of
extortion
AMI,
where he laid out.
where he laid out.
You don't get
the
extortion
photos,
by mail. But I think the important thing is not whether the statute could be construed to make this extortion. It's whether the First Amendment would permit that. And I think it's very important to give the First Amendment the kind of breathing room. This is not the first time in our history this has happened. Do you remember the story of Thomas Jefferson and James Callender? James Callender was the National Enquirer of 1800 and constantly was engaged in threats. He threatened Jefferson, he threatened Adams, but we had a First Amendment. Callender was, in fact, arrested under the Alien and Sedition Act, and Jefferson then pardoned him. We have to give breathing room to the First Amendment. When there are any doubts about whether extortion applies, you resolve those doubts in favor of freedom of the press. Let Bezos fight and argue in the public. Let him release his posts. Let the other side argue. But let's not get prosecutors investigating how journalists operate, because that endangers the freedoms under the First Amendment.
Yeah, but the fact that that American media is a media entity does not immunize them from the types of crimes we're talking about here. Again, I'm not saying that it is a crime, but I'm saying this notion that because it's a fight between two media entities, therefore it means that the laws are different. Just doesn't make any sense to me.
It does mean that the laws are different.
Not when it comes to letters to one another in terms of threatening. No, it doesn't.
It does. Let me tell you why. For example, if the newspapers stole materials and published them like WikiLeaks or any of the other things. If any of us did that, we might be guilty of crimes. But when journalists do it, there is a certain exemption that applies under the First Amendment. So you have to look at every statute on the books, and you have to ask yourself, how does this fit into the theory of breathing room under the First Amendment? Justice Brennan always wrote about breathing room and how you have to interpret statutes narrowly when it comes to First Amendment concerns. When you have a media that is publishing material, then you have to ask yourself the question, what precedent will this have? Because today it's the National Enquirer. Tomorrow, it could be the New York Times or ABC News.
When the New York,
Precedents established on bad guys get applied to good guys. That's why we need to rigorously apply the First Amendment.
That's true, except when the New York Times and ABC News start threatening to publish nude pictures, you know, it does then say, is this really a journalistic entity anymore?
Well, I have been threatened on numerous occasions by journalists who say, unless you give me an interview, unless you give me a response to this, we will publish this, we will publish that. Hardball threats by journalists are fairly common today, and particularly by journalists like the National Enquirer. You don't want to put the National Enquirer out of business. It was not a good day for the First Amendment when Gawker was put out of business. And it wouldn't be a good day for the First Amendment if the National Enquirer were put out of business.
We're out of time, but I just have to ask you one more question. Doesn't it change this at all? Doesn't the fact that the National Enquirer agents of the National Enquirer admitted in that Southern District Cooperation Agreement that they were acting as agents, not as journalists, but as agents of President Trump, doesn't that color this at all?
You can be both. You can both be, you know, a lot of newspapers were started as party newspapers for particular political parties. So you can both be an agent, if that's true, and you can also be exercising your First Amendment rights as a person in the media.
But you don't want to be an agent of someone and committing a potential crime in that context. That's a very different scenario.
But the question is, does the First Amendment permit
The First Amendment
crime?
doesn't protect crimes, Alan. It doesn't protect
First
against
Amendment
crime.
construes what a crime means.
It can.
It helps interpret whether or not a statute is criminal, and you resolve all doubts in favor of the First Amendment. You started out, Dan, by saying this was ambiguous.
It is.
That's the end of the inquiry. If it's ambiguous and we have a First Amendment, prosecutors shouldn't be looking into this and hurting the First Amendment.
They should be looking into it, and we'll see what they decide.
And it clearly is not the end of the debate. Thank you guys for those lively contributions. Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.